everybody, today I'm back and today I'm going to be doing a wrap-up for the kind of past weird intermediate 4-month or so period where I've not really done one of these. So this is going to be basically everything I've read for the past few months. The only exceptions, which I'm going to say right now, is I've read quite a lot of books that I'm working on in my job, and I'm not going to be reviewing them. Obviously, conflict of interest, loads of different factors to it. It just doesn't make sense for me to review the books that I personally am working on or promoting. So I'm not going to talk about them, but there are other books I've read. I haven't only read these books, I've read a lot more, don't you worry. And just wanted to get that out of the way to start with. The exception is I will be reviewing books from the publisher that I work for as long as I'm not directly related to the book or the campaign. I don't mind in that case because then it's just like a normal book for me. But books where I'm directly involved, I'm not going to talk about those on this channel. Without further ado then, now I've got the technicalities out of the way, these are the books I've been reading for the past few months. The first books I'm going to talk about are ones that I read for my 500 subscriber giveaway. So I won't go into the full details, but essentially I picked a viewer who had commented their 3 favourite books. I then read those 3 favourite books and I basically picked 3 personal picks which I think they'll really enjoy, but probably haven't heard of, for them to read, which I've then posted out to the winner, who was called Claire. So, the 3 books that Claire picked, which are the books that I read, are these 3. So, The Secret History by Donna Tartt, A Tale for the Time Being by Rita Zecchi, and Girl Meets Boy by Ali Smith. So I'm not going to go into full detail about reviewing these here because I've got another video where I announce the results of that giveaway, which I'll link down below, where I talk about these in more detail. But basically all you need to know is that they're all cracking books. Donna Tartt's Secret History is now in probably my top 10 books of all time, and probably my top 5 fiction books. I absolutely adored it. But all 3 are just really interesting books you should give a read. But like I say, I'll leave a link down below with more details about what I thought. Sticking with fiction then, the next book I read was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland. So this is obviously one of those books that's so iconic. Everyone knows about this book, and it is such a beautiful edition that I've got here as well. I love this series, and this is one of my favourite covers as well. And I just decided it was one of those books I needed to finally get around to reading. I've seen a couple of the films and seen other bits of media inspired by it. Never read the original. Having now read the original, I can officially tell you it's really, really weird. Like, really weird. But it does cover loads of really interesting ideas. It covers things about aging and memory, and the chronology of time and future and past and how all that links together. Really interesting, unusual subjects. But the problem is it doesn't cover them very much because it's almost like it's just a flight of fancy that was going on in Lewis Carroll's head at the time. I just feel like he jumps around between these ideas without really exploring them too much. But overall I did enjoy it. I gave it a 6.5 out of 10, which I think is a good score. And I think it's one of those ones that you should read because it is an iconic book. And mainly because it's just the weirdest book I've ever read, and that is saying something. I've read some weird stuff, and it's the weirdest one, so I think it's definitely worth a read for that alone. So the next 3 books which I read were kind of crime thriller books of different types, and the first one was one that was Booker Prize shortlisted, and that's His Bloody Project by Graham McCrae Burnett. And this is a really unusual book. It's set in kind of mid-19th century Scotland, and it takes a really unusual form. Essentially, it's the story of a crime and trial where a young crofter is accused of murdering a guy that lives in his village and his 2 kids. And it takes a really unusual narrative style in that the first bit you open up with is kind of these victim, kind of almost like witness studies of how people thought about the main character, what their impressions were, the statements they'd given to court. And that's a really unusual start straight away. You get really thrown straight into it. This is basically a really early legal thriller. Really interesting. It then moves on to be an autobiography written by the suspect himself. And then it moves on to so many different things. Like there's newspaper reports of the trial. There's psychological evaluations. There's medical reports. Just really interesting, very different narrative styles used. And what's really interesting about it is that all of the narrative styles are kind of unreliable. So whether it's the witness statements, which are obviously coloured by other things that have gone on in the past, or even the psychologist, who's got very arcane beliefs about psychology and madness, and then the guy's story itself, the autobiography. Which, the thing which really amazes me about it is, in most books, say Wuthering Heights for example, you know it's an unreliable narrator, and it's quite obvious what is unreliable about it. In Wuthering Heights, he's a bit snooty, he's a bit urbanised, he doesn't really understand how these people live, and that really colours his view of it. In this, you have no idea what the ulterior motive is behind the narrative. You don't know what point what the whole reason he's writing this is. It tells you one thing, you don't know whether to believe it, and you just can never quite know why you can't trust it. You can't, you know there's something off, but you don't know what it is that's tweaking it, so it keeps you guessing the whole way through in a really unusual way I've not seen before. It's a really unreliable narrator, but you can't rely on why he's unreliable, if that makes sense. And it's absolutely fascinating the way it does it. The characters are really good. It's a really well-crafted kind of portrait of the period, and I just really enjoyed it. There are a few bits in it which I feel like are a little bit left to the wayside, and because of the format of it being this trial, you can understand why. But like the main character's got 2 younger siblings who are literally mentioned about 3 times in the book. And just little things like that where I would have wanted it to be all filled out. But all in all, really interesting. Completely get why it was Booker Prize listed, even if it is so much different to normal. And I think if you like a good literary thriller, you'll really enjoy this. I gave this an 8.5 out of 10. Now the next one is the complete opposite end of the scale. It's War with Russia by basically this guy, Sir Richard Sheriff, who used to be essentially the deputy head of the military for NATO in Europe. So really interesting position. But that's where it all starts to fall apart, is that it's almost like he's showing off about this position he's had. At every point he uses really fancy, unnecessary acronyms and then feels the need to explain them. And there's a lot of exposition, and almost it feels like a lot of, oh, look how much I know. Look how realistic this is. Look how much you can trust what I'm saying. And it really jerks you out of it. So, for example, in the first 1 or 2 chapters, you're introduced to a character who is part of the FSB, which is basically the Russian Secret Service. And now the author does not stop telling you that. The first time it's the FSB, the successor to the KGB. Fine, get it. Then in the 3rd chapter he says the exact same thing, and he keeps prompting these explanations of what these acronyms and roles are. Whereas once you've been told once, maybe even twice, fine, he just keeps ramming it down your throat, and it really jerks you out and makes it quite unpleasant to read. I don't know whether it was poorly edited, I don't know whether it was just not very well written, but those things really jerked me out of it, which is a shame because the plot itself is really interesting. It feels so realistic, especially at the minute with everything that's going on in politics and kind of the ongoing issues with Russia. It's a really interesting, all of it feels like it could genuinely happen, and that is terrifying, and that's a really strong point to start from. You can tell he knows his stuff. I just feel like he shows it off a little bit too much. I gave it a 7 out of 10. Next up is another thriller, and this is a brilliant one. It's Ragdoll by Daniel Cole. So this is publishing in early 2017, got an advanced copy which I was so desperate for. And essentially it's about a body that's found which is made up of parts of 5 different people sewn into one body. Grisly start. But what's really interesting is it is quite witty, quite funny, very British in its style. So the main character is called Wolf, and he's got a really dry sense of humour. And it's just packed full of little references to like London house prices and strange bits of British pop culture and the way the policing system works in Britain. It's just really unusual in how it does it, and because it's so funny and witty, it feels quite light to read, even though it is really quite gruesome. The characters are also really, really good. There's 4 or 5 main characters, and they've all got really deep layers to them. At some point I suspected them all of being a little bit dodgy, and that's one of the real tricks, is that you never, legitimately never know. I was convinced halfway through that I knew who the culprit was. I was like dead set, this is who it is, this is how it's happening. So wrong, and it's just such an interesting group of characters and the way they interact in the relationships, and I really enjoyed it for a thriller. It kept me guessing and laughing and hooked a lot better than anything has in a long time, since things like The Widow that I read nearly a year ago now. So this is a really, really fantastic thriller. I think it's going to be huge in 2017. There's a lot of big thrillers coming out, a few others which I'm hoping to get in the next few weeks, but I think this could be absolutely massive. I gave this a 9 out of 10. And now here we are. It wouldn't be one of my videos without a bit of non-fiction. So for non-fiction, I read Germany by Neil MacGregor. So Neil MacGregor is the guy who wrote the History of the World in 100 Objects, which I've talked about on here before, which I found very dense and hard work. So I wasn't quite sure what to think with this. But the real hook on this is that it's really illustrated. So each chapter literally is probably half images and half text, and it really breaks it up, and the images are so powerful, whether that's pictures of ancient manuscripts or pictures of slogans from the Cold War era in Germany, and it's just really unusual. Really, as it says, it's a real portrait and memory of a nation. You really get to grips with Germany. It covers a really wide time period, kind of before the inception of Germany as a country, right through its inception, World War I, World War II, the Cold War, modern Germany. It's just a really overarching tale, really well written, really enjoyable and really easy to flick through, and it is a really gorgeous book. Really good history in a really kind of pick up and read kind of way that I think anyone with a general interest will really enjoy. I gave this an 8 out of 10. So next up is a kind of different non-fiction book, and this is Suspicious Minds by Rob Brotherton. So, I might have talked about this before, but I think conspiracy theories are really interesting. Not necessarily because I believe them, but because I think it's interesting to see how the human mind fills those spaces we don't know. So, things like the Roswell crash. Nobody knows really what it was. People's minds make really different explanations for it. Some people immediately leap to these kind of really what sounds on the surface like far-flung conspiracies, and they may well be. But I just think it's fascinating that the brain does that, and this is a book which basically explores how all of that works. So this goes into the science of why your brain processes things in certain ways, and why you might be inclined to therefore fill these gaps with these kind of really grand, overarching ideas and schemes. And it does cover conspiracy theories in a really non-critical way. It doesn't spend the whole time ridiculing them, it doesn't spend the whole time arguing for them, it just kind of explains where they come from and why they're there. But it also links it to really interesting, useful real-world things, like why do you roll a dice differently depending on whether you want to get a high or low number? And just little things like that. Why do people think that big events need to have big explanations? Why can a plane crash where hundreds of people die not just be because of some error? Why does it have to be some conspiracy? And why does it have to be a big explanation? Why does somebody have to be at fault? Things like that. It's a really interesting, unusual non-fiction. It's quite dense, it's not the easiest of reads, there's a lot of references, but if you've got an interest in this kind of psychology or in conspiracy theories and how they work, this is a really good read. I gave it 7.5 out of 10. And the last one is very similar, it's Malcolm Gladwell's David and Goliath. So I've had this on my shelf for about a year now, and Malcolm Gladwell, having read people like John Ronson and Oliver Sacks, I know I'm going to enjoy Malcolm Gladwell. I don't know why it took me so long to pick it up, but this is basically an interesting look at underdogs, and whether being an underdog really is being an underdog, if that makes sense. The fact that basically in some situations being an underdog is much more enviable than being the giant, because it uses the whole story of David and Goliath as a setup and explains kind of how that could have happened. But it also goes into interesting things about why sports teams that have got seemingly worse players can beat the best players in the world. Things like that, really interesting, unusual stories and tales, and things about crime rates, and it covers everything. It's international, it covers France, the US, Ireland, and it covers everything from politics to sports to pop culture, just like the whole range. It's really, really interesting. Now, what really makes this good is the way that he links it all up into one overarching narrative, all these little stories combine into this one really interesting tapestry that proves his point. The one problem I think is he doesn't drive it home enough. I think the last chapter is a really interesting example, but I don't think it quite cements his points enough, and I feel like there's a few loose ends that he could have tied in so easily with just a few more sentences that I think I'd have benefited from, and I feel like I probably aren't the only one that felt like that. But all in all, I loved this. I'm going to read a lot more Malcolm Gladwell stuff because it's right up my street. Very similar to John Ronson in style, and it's just the same kind of interesting, smart psychology stuff I love. I give this an 8.5 out of 10. So there we have it. That is my wrap-up for basically the past 3 or 4 months. As I've said, I've probably read another 9 or 10 books for work, which I'm not going to talk about, but I'm still really impressed with the stuff I've read. There's a lot more fiction than normal, which I think is because I've kind of diversified the kind of fiction I'm reading. Like, a few years ago, I'd have never looked at the Booker Prize shortlist, and now I'm, like, interested to see. And similarly, I might not have read The War with Russia and things like that, and it's really interesting that I've branched out that way. I would love to know what you guys think. I'm sure there's a few books there that some of you will have read. I'd love to know whether what you think matches up with what I think, and any suggestions you've got based on what I've said or what you've read would be hugely appreciated. I would say I'm actually getting to the end of my books on my shelf at this point. I've been looking through and seeing what I've got left, and I've probably only got about 30 books on my shelf which I haven't read. So I'm starting to get to the point where I am going to need to buy some books. God damn it, it's such a hard life. So I could do with some suggestions from you guys, that would be massively appreciated. Other than that, I'm going to leave my Twitter and my Goodreads and links to previous videos, as I've mentioned before, in the description down below. And other than that, thank you so much for watching, and I look forward to seeing you soon with my next video.